Ethan sat alone at the dining table, tracing the rim of his coffee mug with one finger, letting the warmth sink into his skin. It was late, and the dim light from the kitchen barely reached him. Shadows clung to the corners of the room, mirroring the clouded thoughts he couldn't shake. 3 months ago, Maya would have been here, curled up on the sofa with her feet tucked under her, flipping through some articles she'd found interesting enough to share. They'd laugh, argue over the dumbest things, then make up with ease until lately, when everything felt like sand slipping between his fingers. These days, he'd catch her staring off, lost in a thought she never shared, her phone in her lap with the screen carefully angled away from him. It was all so subtle, so small, he couldn't be sure he wasn't imagining it. Ethan wanted to believe he was. He wanted to think the little glances she gave her phone, the new habit of lowering her voice on certain calls, the unexpected nights working late were just passing quirks in a long-term relationship. Yet somehow Maya seemed to be everywhere, and nowhere at once, a shadow of herself that left him questioning if he'd ever really known her. It was last Saturday night that the name Zack had slipped out so casually from her lips. She'd returned from the gym, flushed and tired, but with an energy that struck him as different, like she just had a coffee with an old friend. When he'd asked how her workout was, she'd grinned and mentioned how Zack showed me this amazing new routine then, brushing it off with a laugh, she added, "He's just a friend. You'd like him." Ethan forced himself to smile, though something twisted uncomfortably in his gut. He'd known Maya long enough to know her usual workout partners, mostly her friend Sarah, and a few other women who shared her fitness goals. But Zack? She'd never mentioned him before. That night, he'd tried to let it go, to trust her words, to believe it was just what she said, it was a friendship. It wasn't until Zack's name started cropping up more often that Ethan found himself unable to ignore it. One night, they'd made plans for dinner, and he'd prepared a meal he knew she loved, pasta with a homemade sauce that took hours to simmer. He'd set the table, lit a few candles, and even put on a playlist of her favorite jazz songs. But an hour before she was supposed to be home, she called him, her voice rushed and apologetic. "I'm so sorry, Ethan," she'd said. "Something came up. Zack, he's going through a tough time, and he really needs someone to talk to. I'll be home later tonight, okay?" Ethan had barely managed to keep his voice steady. "So Zack needs you tonight." "All right. I guess I'll see you when you get back." She hadn't heard the hurt in his voice, or if she did, she'd chosen to ignore it. She hung up quickly, promising she'd make it up to him. Alone at the table, Ethan had stared at the food going cold in front of him, listening to the slow drawl of the jazz that felt absurdly out of place now. A deep ache lodged itself in his chest as he began packing away the dinner, wondering how he'd ended up here alone, his girlfriend off with some man he'd never met. The next morning, she'd returned with a coffee and an apology, dismissing his questions with a breezy explanation about Zack's problems and insisting there was nothing for him to worry about. She even made a joke about how he was being paranoid, grinning as if her laughter would erase his doubts. But it didn't. Now he found himself noticing every little thing. The way she angled her phone away, that tiny hesitation in her voice when she said she loved him, as if the words had worn thin. Ethan hated how he felt, like he was becoming someone suspicious and needy, picking at scraps for clues. But something gnawed at him, a need for the truth, however bitter it might be. And then 2 days later, he found something that shifted his unease into a deep, simmering anger. Maya had left her gym bag at home, dashing out the door in a hurry one morning for an early work meeting. When Ethan went to tidy up the room, he picked up her bag to put it away, only for something hard to slide from the bottom pocket and fall onto the floor. It was a key. Not just any key, he'd never seen it before. A shiny brass piece with a little tag that had a strange address scrawled on it in her handwriting. Curious and feeling his pulse quicken, he did a quick search on his phone. The address wasn't for a gym or an office, but for a nondescript building across town, a studio apartment complex. One of those places you'd only need if you wanted privacy. Ethan's hands clenched around the key as he stared down at it, an uncomfortable realization dawning in him. Why would Maya have a key to an apartment he knew nothing about? He fought the impulse to drive there immediately, telling himself there had to be a simple explanation, but the gnawing ache in his chest wouldn't ease. Later that night, Maya came home with a bright smile, a tone as light as if nothing had changed, as if she weren't holding on to a secret she didn't want him to know. For a moment, Ethan felt sick at the sight. A wave of anger he swallowed down as he tried to meet her eyes, his heart pounding out of sync. "Hey, you're home early," she said, barely glancing at him as she slipped off her shoes and headed straight for her phone, flipping through notifications. "Yeah, figured I'd come back and spend some time with you," he replied, forcing his voice into something he hoped sounded casual. She barely looked up. "Oh, well, I just have to reply to these work messages real quick," she said, disappearing into the other room without another glance. It was like he'd become invisible to her, some kind of background noise she could tune out whenever it suited her. And every second, the image of the studio apartment key burned in his mind. Ethan couldn't ignore it anymore. The next day, when Maya was supposed to be at a conference call that would conveniently last all morning, Ethan found himself driving across town, following the map on his phone to the studio apartment. He didn't even know what he was hoping to find: confirmation, closure, or some undeniable sign that would either reveal the truth or, by some miracle, prove his doubts wrong. When he arrived at the building, it was small and unremarkable, a modest complex with faded walls and a cracked driveway. He hesitated at the door, his heart pounding as he stared down at the key in his hand. A part of him still hoped it wouldn't work, that he'd misread everything, and that Maya's words would be the truth after all. But when he slid the key into the lock, it turned easily, the click echoing through the silent hallway. Inside, the air felt cold, carrying a faint scent of perfume he knew all too well: Maya's. There was no denying it now. The apartment was modest, neatly arranged, with a few basic furnishings: a small sofa, a bed, a kitchen counter scattered with coffee mugs, and a half-eaten loaf of bread. A pang of pain and disgust twisted in his gut as he took in the scene, realizing just how comfortable she was here. Then he saw a framed photo on the bedside table, showing Maya and a man he'd never met before, arms slung around each other, laughing as if they had the world at their feet. His hand trembled as he picked it up, his eyes lingering on the face of the man he assumed had to be Zack. Tall, lean, with a too-perfect smile that now felt like an open wound. Next to the photo was a small trinket box. Inside, he found a bracelet he recognized, one he'd seen Zack wearing in a social media photo Maya had casually shown him. She'd dismissed it as an old gift from a friend. Now he knew it was far more than that. Each piece of evidence felt like a shard of glass cutting into him, carving out every ounce of trust he'd ever had in her. It was clear now Maya had never been only friends with Zack. Ethan placed the photo back on the table, his hand steady in a way that surprised him. The shock had settled now, cooling into something else, a cold certainty that swallowed up the last traces of disbelief. He could almost see them here, laughing, sharing meals, the moments she should have shared with him. The betrayal sat heavy in his chest, hollowing him out, leaving only a dark, simmering resentment. When he returned home that night, Maya greeted him with a kiss as if nothing had changed. Her easy smile, the familiar light in her eyes, it was a skill. He realized the way she masked everything beneath that facade of warmth. Part of him wanted to confront her right there, to throw everything in her face and watch her deny it. But he held back, reining in the urge, letting it settle until it turned into a different kind of resolve. He wanted her to feel the same sick betrayal that now festered inside him. She had chosen to deceive him, to live a life filled with lies and half-truths, and it was time she saw what that choice cost. A plan formed in his mind over the next few days, slow and deliberate. He would expose her in a way that she couldn't lie her way out of. She would have no choice but to confront the truth, to see the consequences of her choices, all without the grace of a quiet ending. That Friday night, he suggested they have a night in. "I'll cook dinner," he offered with a smile that barely touched his eyes. She beamed, seemingly relieved by his relaxed tone. "God, it's been a rough week at work," she sighed, curling up beside him on the couch. "This is exactly what I need. Just us, some good food, maybe a little wine." "Sounds perfect," he replied, his voice calm, hiding the edge he felt within. "Actually, I was thinking we could make it a little special. I invited someone I think you'd like to see." She raised an eyebrow, curious. "Oh? Who?" He kept his smile in place. "Zack," he said simply. "I thought it would be nice to get to know him better, since you two have become so close." For a split second, her face paled, and he watched as she fought to keep her expression steady, the carefully curated look of casual surprise. "Zack," she repeated, voice faltering just slightly. "You didn't. I wasn't expecting." "I know. It's a bit spontaneous," he replied, his tone light but his gaze unyielding. "But you're always saying he's a friend. I thought it'd be nice to bring him into our home, really get to know him, especially since you spend so much time together." Maya managed a thin smile, her fingers tapping nervously on the arm of the couch. "Right. Yeah, of course. Just unexpected, that's all." "Good," he said, standing up. "Dinner will be ready in an hour." As he moved to the kitchen, he could feel her watching him, her nervous gaze following him, as if she were trying to read something in his expression. But he gave nothing away, pouring every bit of focus into preparing the dinner, setting the table, and making sure each detail was in place. He wanted everything to be perfect, each element primed for the truth to unfurl in front of her. At precisely 7, the doorbell rang, and Ethan went to answer, his heart steady with a sense of grim satisfaction. Zack stood on the other side, holding a bottle of wine and wearing a polite, almost uncomfortable smile. He looked genuinely surprised to see Ethan open the door but quickly composed himself. "Hey man," Zack said, offering a handshake. Thanks for the invite. Maya didn't mention you'd be hosting tonight." Ethan's smile was tight. "She didn't know until recently. But I wanted this dinner to be a chance for us all to get comfortable with each other. Come in." As Zack entered, Maya appeared in the doorway of the kitchen, her expression barely masking her discomfort. She forced a smile, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "Hey Zack," she greeted, her tone forced, the warmth strained. "I wasn't sure you'd actually come." Zack's confusion deepened, but he nodded. "Yeah, I didn't want to intrude, but Ethan insisted." Ethan gestured for them to sit, pulling out a bottle of wine and filling their glasses. The three of them settled around the table, with Maya looking between Ethan and Zack, her smile faltering under the weight of the tension. As the dinner began, Ethan eased into conversation, keeping it polite but pointed, each question carefully crafted to force her to confront what she'd been hiding. He steered the topics toward mutual friends, subtly bringing up her late nights and the gym sessions she claimed to attend with Zack, all while watching her squirm under Zack's increasingly perplexed gaze. Finally, after a lull in the conversation, Ethan set his glass down, the silence stretching long enough to draw their full attention. So he began, his tone too casual. "I've noticed Maya's been spending a lot of time at that little studio apartment across town. Have you been there, Zack?" The question landed like a blow, shattering the thin veneer of composure Maya had managed to maintain. Her eyes went wide, her face draining of color as Zack's own confusion shifted into understanding. He turned to Maya, an incredulous expression taking over his features. "Wait." The studio, Zack's voice was low, laced with disbelief. "You told me that place was just for you, that no one else even knew about it." Maya stammered, her gaze darting between them, desperate for a way out, for words that wouldn't come. "Ethan, it's not. It's not what you think." He held her gaze, unmoved. "Then why don't you tell me exactly what it is?" Her hands twisted in her lap, her lips parting in an attempt to say something, anything, but no words followed. For the first time, Ethan saw real fear in her eyes, the full weight of her lies unraveling around her. Zack shook his head slowly, his own anger building. "So all this time you've been playing both of us?" I didn't mean for this to happen," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It just got out of control." Ethan let her words hang in the air, refusing to break the silence, watching as she grappled with the depth of her betrayal. Zack sat back, shaking his head in disbelief, the realization settling over him in heavy waves. Ethan felt a dark satisfaction at the sight, knowing that Maya was finally facing the consequences she tried so hard to avoid. "Funny how you didn't mean for anything to happen," Ethan said, his voice low but sharp, "yet you managed to lie to both of us without a second thought. You had an entire life you kept from me, one you thought I'd never discover." Maya's face twisted with desperation, a hand reaching out to him. "Ethan, please. I'm sorry, I know it's hard to understand, but—" "Oh, I understand perfectly," he cut in, his voice cold. "You wanted everything. You wanted me here, waiting for you, while you lived another life with him." He nodded toward Zack, who was still shaking his head in disbelief. She turned to Zack, a plea in her eyes. "Please, you have to believe me. This wasn't what I wanted. I got lost." Zack's gaze was unyielding. "Lost? That's what you call it?" He rose, pushing his chair back. "I came here tonight thinking you'd invited me, that this was just some casual dinner. I never imagined I'd walk into this." Ethan could feel a strange satisfaction settle over him as Zack left, his footsteps echoing down the hall, leaving Maya alone with the consequences of her choices. The weight of her betrayal hung thick in the silence that followed, and he watched as she finally faced him, a raw desperation in her eyes. "Ethan, please," she whispered. "I don't want to lose you. We can fix this. I know it seems bad, but it doesn't have to be over." He took a deep breath, feeling the last remnants of his anger settle into something calm and final. "It was over the moment you chose to lie to me," he said quietly. "You just didn't know it yet." Without another word, he stood, leaving her sitting alone at the table with the life she'd ruined, a life she could no longer hide behind lies. As he walked away, he felt the faintest sense of relief, knowing he'd taken back his power, the control she'd so carelessly stripped away. When he closed the door behind him, the weight of the betrayal lifted, leaving only the resolve to start anew, free from the hollow promises she'd once made. Ethan knew he should feel relief. He had finally confronted Maya, shattered the web of lies she'd spun, and exposed her betrayal in a way that left no room for denial. But even as he walked away, shutting the door on her pleading, desperate eyes, a hollow ache remained in his chest. The weight of her deceit lingered, twisting every memory they'd shared into something tainted, as if the very fabric of his life had been unwoven, leaving only threads in his hands. For days he didn't answer her calls. She sent messages, emails, even left handwritten letters in his mailbox, begging him to talk, to reconsider. Each message grew more frantic, but Ethan remained resolute. He had said what he needed to, and as much as he wanted her out of his life, he wanted her to feel the full weight of her choices. He wanted her to see that betrayal had a painful public cost that would haunt her far beyond their last conversation. It was during one of those restless, early mornings when Ethan felt a spark of an idea form a final act, a way to truly drive the message home. He remembered the friends they had in common, the social circles that intertwined their lives, the many people who would be as shocked as he had been to learn the truth about Maya. It wasn't enough to leave her alone with her guilt. He wanted the truth to echo in every corner of her world. He wanted her to lose the same sense of security she'd stolen from him. He spent hours crafting a message, one that was clear, factual, and utterly devoid of the emotion that had once tied him to her. He included just enough detail to convey the gravity of her deception, attaching the photo of her and Zack he'd found in the studio apartment as irrefutable evidence. The final message went out to everyone they knew, her family, her friends, even colleagues she'd mentioned but he'd never met. When he pressed send, a sense of finality washed over him. The truth was out, and now it was her turn to confront the reality she'd tried to keep hidden. The fallout was swift. Maya called him within hours, her voice a mix of fury and panic. "Ethan, what did you do?" she demanded, her voice barely controlled. "Everyone, my family, my friends, everyone is calling me. Do you understand what you've done?" He kept his tone even, refusing to let her pull him into her desperation. "I told the truth, Maya. You're always saying honesty is important. I thought it was time to share it." "You're punishing me," she choked out, her voice catching. "You're trying to ruin my life?" "I didn't ruin anything," he replied, his tone icy. "I just made sure people knew who you really are." Her voice broke, a mix of anger and disbelief. But he didn't stay on the call long enough to hear her protest further. She had chosen her path, and now she could walk it alone. In the days that followed, he heard the whispers. Friends who had once looked at him with sympathy began to see him with a new respect, some even expressing their shock over Maya's deceit. Her friends, too, had reached out to him, some apologizing for ever doubting his instincts, others simply stunned by the woman they thought they knew. Maya's perfect life unraveled rapidly. He heard through mutual friends that her family had distanced themselves, ashamed of her actions, and that she'd been staying at Zack's studio, unable to face the judgment that surrounded her. The scandal even affected Zack, who lost his job when an anonymous tip led to an investigation into his after-hours activities with a client. For Ethan, a strange sense of justice settled in his bones. He had lost the woman he once loved, but he'd regained his pride, his dignity, and a measure of control over his life. It wasn't a perfect victory, but it was enough. One afternoon, as he packed up the last of his things to leave the apartment they had once shared, Ethan found a small, worn-out notebook buried under a stack of books. He recognized it immediately. It was Maya's, the one she used to jot down her thoughts, scribble poems, and sometimes write letters she never intended to send. Part of him wanted to throw it away, to be done with everything she'd left behind, but curiosity got the better of him. Flipping through the pages, he saw fragments of the woman he'd fallen in love with, her dreams, her fears, the ambitions she'd shared with him so freely in the early days. But as he neared the end, he found something else, a passage written only weeks ago, describing her torn feelings, her struggle between two lives, and the guilt that had been eating at her. In one line, she'd written, "I know I'm destroying everything good I have, but I can't stop myself." A bitter laugh escaped him. She had known, all along, what her choices would cost, yet she had chosen them anyway. And here, on these pages, was her confession, the one she could never bring herself to speak out loud. He closed the notebook and set it aside, the last pieces of his heartbreak settling into place. Maya was a stranger now, someone who had once shared his life, his hopes, his bed, but who no longer had any place in his world. As he walked out of the apartment, he left the notebook on the counter, a relic of a love that had once been real, now no more than a hollow memory. A few days later, Ethan moved to a new place across town, a modest apartment that didn't hold the shadows of a life he'd left behind. There was no trace of her here, no reminders of the betrayal that had once consumed him. It was a fresh start, a blank slate, and for the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of peace settling over him. He stood by the window, watching the city lights flicker against the evening sky, feeling a quiet strength that hadn't been there before. He'd lost something he thought he could never live without, but in that loss, he'd found something else: clarity, resilience, a confidence that had been buried under years of misplaced trust. As the sun dipped below the skyline, Ethan took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the past finally lift, leaving him free to step forward into a future he could now shape on his own terms.